Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another thoughtful episode of The Lion's Den. I'm your host, Venezia Leone, and today I sat down with Natan Shahar, an entrepreneur working at the intersection of energy, infrastructure, and decarbonization. Natan's work challenges the way most people think about energy, not as something we simply produce and consume, but as a system that can be redesigned, where waste can be converted back into fuel and existing infrastructure can be leveraged rather than replaced. In this episode, we talk about the limitations of electrification, the hidden constraints within our current energy systems, and how new models, like turning carbon emissions into usable energy, could reshape how energy is stored, distributed, and monetized. We also explore the economic realities behind the energy transition and what it'll take to actually scale solutions in this space. This episode is extremely insightful, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, Natan. So happy to have you on the Lion's Den today.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on the show.
Excited to chat. So most people think of energy as production and consumption, but you and your company are thinking about it completely differently. Where did that perspective come from? How did you get here?
So really the genesis comes from my background working as a building energy efficiency consultant in New York City. My whole career, I'm licensed in New York State. I've been working with landlords, real estate operators, primarily in the New York City region, helping them just reduce their electricity, gas, and oil usage to make their buildings more efficient and more cost effective. Then in 2019, this law came out, Local Law 97, that put the most expensive price on carbon emissions on the planet. More than 3 times the price in the European Union or any comparable place. So New York City really decided to go from virtually nothing to leading the pack. And my customers that I work with, they came to me and said, okay, what do we do about this? The law had sort of appeared where it was passed, and then it didn't go into action until 2025. So at that point, this was 6 years away. So they said, what do we do when this hits? And I said, well, if they're serious about this law, then you should sell all your buildings now, because it's going to be very difficult to comply with what's written here if they actually proceed. And the response, of course, was, well, I live in my condo or co-op, so give me a solution. It happened to be at the exact same time the law was passed. I was just for fun reading a book about Mars missions, believe it or not, called The Case for Mars by Dr. Robert Zubrin, which was written in the early 1990s. And the key idea in that book is that you're going to use the atmosphere of Mars, which is carbon dioxide, as the material to create rocket fuel on Mars for the return trip to Earth. And I had never been exposed to this possibility before, but I was very impressed by it. I said, well, if you can do that on Mars, presumably you can do that in the chimney of a boiler in a building in New York City or chimney of a power plant a lot more efficiently and a lot easier, because it's typically easier to do things here than it is in outer space. So
I don't know, jury's still out on that one.
Right. I guess Elon Musk would argue not for data centers, but most other people who've done the math think it's crazy. So that was the beginning. And so I said, so basically I can use what comes out of a generator, which is carbon dioxide, as the feedstock to produce what goes in, which is fuel. And I just need to add electricity essentially on an intermittent basis to run this process. So what that means is, getting back to your original question, the physical material that we burn in our cars or in our boilers or in our factories or power plants, really it's an energy carrier. It's not the energy itself. It's the carbon atom, essentially. When it is fuel, then it's attached to hydrogen atoms. That's why every chemical formula for fuel, whether it's benzene or diesel or natural gas, methane, you always see a C with a bunch of hydrogens and a bunch of numbers. And what comes out is always that same C, the carbon atom, but now the H's, the hydrogen is gone, and what you have C attached to an O, because it's carbon dioxide, carbon with oxygen molecules. So what has happened is that that carbon atom goes from point A to point B through the device, whether it's a car engine or a boiler or a power plant, and all you've done is it started off with energy attached to it, and it leaves with that energy basically gone or dissipated. So theoretically, you can reverse the process. And in fact, it's not theoretical. It's been done for more than 100 years. It's 19th century chemistry, taking carbon dioxide, combining it with hydrogen and producing fuel, which then if you burn it, you end up with carbon dioxide again. So that was the beginning, and everything stemmed from that first sort of discovery.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you were doing that, like Newton's law of like matter, I think it's new, like matter cannot be created nor destroyed. Like it makes total sense what you're saying. The left side of the equation has to equal the right side of the equation. So you're either losing water or you're losing oxygen, or, there's some byproduct, but in the end, the molecules are, what goes in, what comes out.
Yeah, the mass, the physical material is conserved. So it's the energy that gets dissipated. So if you can just provide an additional energy source, which is electricity from wind or solar, then you can reverse the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about your journey as an entrepreneur, sort of at the beginning of all of this. So you just sort of told me, I had this background in this industry, things were changing. I saw I was inspired about this opportunity, but now you have a business. So when did that idea sort of turn into, oh, now I can actually build a company around this thing? Were you doing experiments and you got there, or did you get investment, or what was sort of that turning point for you where you decided that?
So I knew that this opportunity for the decarbonization of existing infrastructure was going to stay for not just New York City, but other locations. And I needed a solution to offer to my existing customer base that I was working with. So I was very interested. I initially didn't want to start a separate company. I was looking to just buy equipment to do this from third-party vendors and then just offer it right away. What I discovered very early on was that there was nothing to buy that suited the purpose. So yes, separating carbon dioxide from flue gas has been practiced and is for decades, and Exxon does it every day. They're enhanced oil recovery rigs, but the equipment that they use to do that is absolutely useless for many of the applications that I'm looking at. It's not like you can just purchase it for what you need. And so especially at that time, the electrolyzers to split water into hydrogen were equally extremely expensive and not built to the purpose that I needed. And then while there was a reactor that was and still is actively operational on the International Space Station, taking carbon dioxide and hydrogen to produce water and natural gas, methane, that was a custom built piece that it's not like you can just go to a supplier and buy one. Mm-hmm. So even the pieces of the process weren't really off the shelf. Forget about integrating them into a single product that I could just sort of have flue gas come in one side and natural gas come out the other. And so I said, okay, we need to develop a product. And that's when I started out. I went to the Israeli Ministry of Energy for a grant, a seed grant for a couple $100,000. We won it and then sort of matched that with friends and family round, basically, to start just doing lab scale experimentation. and everything, built from there. It's been 7.5 years, so it's been a long trip so far.
Not as long as the trip to Mars.
No.
No, but that makes sense. I mean, I think it's from my perspective, a very interesting time because there's so much opportunity for us to change the narrative around the consumption of energy, and yet nothing has totally broken through as the solution. And so I imagine that sort of dichotomy between there's a lot of opportunity, but there aren't necessarily already created solutions, and sort of bridging those two together is what you've been working on and what you've been successful in.
Yeah, look, the core idea that we're addressing, or the core problem that we're addressing, is if you open up a depreciation schedule, go on the IRS's website and look at depreciation of equipment, and you look up a boiler or a generator, it's going to say 30 years. So that's Uncle Sam, that's the US government saying this piece of equipment should last 30 years because we're not going to let you claim it as a loss sooner than that. Mm-hmm. Now, if you buy a boiler, therefore, or a similar piece of equipment 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and suddenly there's a new climate mandate that comes in and says, rip it out, put in a heat pump, or rip it out, do this or that, you have a financial problem, because who's going to pay for the fact that that boiler was supposed to last for 30 years? Forget about the fact that now you have to spend money perhaps on something new. But people aren't starting at zero. They're starting at negative. They're starting at the fact that they have existing infrastructure that is still being paid for in some way, shape, or form, or still needs to prove itself out. Or even a more extreme example, in the case of a building in New York City, most of the heating systems are 100 years old. They're steam pipes that were installed in the 1920s. And that is built into the value of the building. The fact that the building has a heating system that has been fully maintained and paid for generations ago and required no sort of investment, more or less, from one owner to the next over the course of decades, means that the price of that building was lower than if it had needed something entirely new. So now if you introduce a law which says you're going to have to rip that out and do things completely differently, you haven't just created a retrofit cost, you've literally shifted the whole value of that asset. And it could be that you've shifted it to a place where now it's underwater relative to the mortgage, relative to the financing. It creates this chain reaction that is difficult. So if you're able to go to that person and say, keep doing exactly what you're doing, just let me buy your flue gas from you, and I'm going to make gold from it, and then I'm going to inject this natural gas right into the existing pipeline network, and that's it. Well, then everybody's open to that. They say, look, as long as you're not causing me too much disruption, and all the more so if there's an actual return on investment when you take into account the entire picture, then it works. But otherwise, it's hard. And this is not just a U.S. problem. Germany froze their electrification of heat law for heat pumps recently, and there's been a lot of struggles in all over the world with decarbonization laws as we've gotten closer to 2030. And that's also not a coincidence. That has to do with the schedule of the Paris Climate Agreement. The first sort of 10 years were fairly easy. It's really 2030 is the first year where it gets very, very tough to meet the targets. And so all the different pieces of legislation around the world that are signed on to this are finding they're hitting against a really tough financial reality.
Yeah. So is that because electrification alone isn't scaling fast enough, like you've said, to due to infrastructure constraints like grids, pipelines, buildings? Like, talk us through that.
So I'm going to stick with New York City as an example, but as I said, it's just one example of many. The Urban Green Council in New York City, a few years after Local Law 97 was passed in 2021, released a report called Grid Ready, where they did the analysis and went block by block and established that almost half of New York City could not electrify their heating with heat pumps in the foreseeable future because of the limitations of the power grid. It had nothing to do. So even if a building owner said, I'm prepared to spend however much it costs to rip out my boiler and put in electric heating systems, they said the grid simply didn't have the transmission capacity to move electricity to those buildings in the quantity that would be needed. And there was no realistic timeline. I mean, the only way that infrastructure gets paid for is by increasing power costs to the consumer, which is a very contentious political issue. So,
especially in New York City.
So the driving problem is that you have very old infrastructure. That's it. And direct electrification, unfortunately, does not solve for the existing infrastructure problem. Even the most basic improvement, like a convection stove. So you want to replace your gas stove with a convection stove. There are a lot of reasons to do that. A lot of times, depending on the electrical service, even in a single family apartment or home, you might not have the power you need for a convection stove to match the same heat output of your gas stove. And so it's not just buying the appliance. Now you have this whole engineering project, potentially upgrading your electrical panel, everything else, just to cook. And I'm not talking about the very significant loads of heating, in a place which has a cold winter.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, where electrification has been easy, and this is also unfortunately created, I think, a lot of the stress in the debate, is in warm climates, electrification is a home run. So if you're in California, where for 90% of the population, they don't really know what winter is, okay? Like in San Francisco, or all the more so LA or San Diego, you can just put on a sweater in the winter and like, it's okay, and in the summer, you can just, sweat a little bit. It's not like New York City where, you sweat to death in the summer and you freeze to death in the winter. So in those types of places, they say, I'll just replace the gas with a heat pump, because number one, the heat pump doesn't need to be built to withstand really tough conditions. Number two, the heat pump is a luxury to begin with. Heating in a climate where heating and cooling is a luxury, not a necessity, then the whole debate is very different.
Yeah.
But in New York City, if you don't have heat in the winter, you die. You just freeze to death. And people unfortunately do every year in Chicago and in Toronto, all these places.
Yeah.
And, they call it the New South because of air conditioning. In the Eastern United States, where you have high humidity, if you don't have air conditioning in the summer, you can't really function. This is just a fact of life. So it's a lot more difficult in places with weather.
Yeah. And I think about that, just even expanding that globally, right? Because at the end of the day, or it's my opinion that this carbon emission issue, change, all of these, it is a global thing that we all need to be working together to make the earth a better, less warm sort of place. So you say that, and then I think about climates in India, or climates in Russia, like those sorts of places. I'm like, wow, those are so different from what San Francisco might experience in terms of their need for electrification. That it just is very disparate.
Yeah, and the good news is that in areas where it really works, it's already winning. So Texas, for better or for worse, does not have much in the way of decarbonization or climate focused legislation at the state level, but they have some of the highest solar and wind and battery deployment rates of anywhere on the planet, and they're one of the most profitable markets for renewable developers to enter, and it has to do with just the economics.
Yeah.
So, and what we're doing is built on that. You asked, what everything that we have focused on rests on the bet that there'll be more and more solar and wind deployment, because our process consumes a lot of electricity. So the only way it works economically is if we're turning carbon dioxide back into natural gas, back into fuel at 2 a.m. with wind power that nobody wants.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, then that's really what generates the value, because there are, the reality is that in North America and in Europe, there are hundreds, sometimes even thousands of hours each year of negatively priced electricity on the open market, where literally the grid operator pays people, pays to take electricity, because wind and solar and hydro and nuclear and sometimes even coal, any inelastic source of supply, is producing power and it can't be turned off efficiently. And so they just need to dump it, because at 3 a.m. in April, there's no heating load, there's no cooling load, and there's very little activity depending on the location. And so you have this enormous surplus. Now, that's why batteries are exploding, because batteries are able to handle a significant portion of this opportunity and shift that load into times where it's more profitable. But because typically batteries are used to store electricity for hours, and we're looking at potentially even 24-hour batteries, so we're not so much there yet. Even that time scale does not create the essentially arbitrage and energy storage opportunities of storing energy for days, weeks, or even seasons. So what we can do is we can capture and store a whole winter's worth of carbon dioxide in New York. So 4 months worth of CO2 as a liquid. It's still very compact. And then when the snow melts in March and the grid is flooded with hydropower that is very cheaply priced at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, we can turn a whole winter's worth of CO2 into natural gas that goes into the pipeline network, and that can be stored for the next winter. One of the big issues that's going on today with what's going on with this war in the Gulf is that Europe typically buys all of their gas storage, all of their gas for the winter in the summer. So they have 6 months of storage. They typically fill up all their gas reservoirs in the summer, which they import from all over the world, a lot of it from the Middle East, which is why they're having difficulty. And then they use that gas they've stored for the winter. So nobody stores energy in batteries for 6 months at a time. Only in fuel do you do that, because of the physics of it, that just the energy density is so much greater when it comes to fuel. So that's why we can essentially load shift 100% of the energy requirements of any process, whether it's direct heating or a power plant or an industrial process, anything that's burning fuel, we can load shift 100% of it, that energy consumption, to renewables, because we're dealing with time horizons of weeks and even months if necessary, as opposed to hours. And we're integrating with the existing infrastructure. So those are the two pieces that really bind it together.
Yeah. So that it sounds like what you just described was what Carbon Bridge is, right? It takes the waste and turns it back into fuel. This might be a whatever simple question, but why do you think this hasn't been done at scale before? Do you think it was sort of a science breakthrough or a business model breakthrough, or what do you think is sort of why this is popping up now and why you guys are leading the industry in this?
So the Paris Climate Agreement definitely triggered enormous investments in any form of decarbonization technology all over the world. And we're one of many companies. We're part of the Electric Natural Gas Coalition based in Brussels. We're one of many companies that are involved in the space. We're the only company with a product that goes end to end from raw combustion exhaust to pipeline grade natural gas that combines essentially carbon capture, electrolysis for hydrogen production, and that methane production piece. But there are other companies that are taking a very different approach in terms of the largest project in the world today is Twin Oaks, actually in the United States in Nebraska. They're taking CO2 from ethanol plants, combining that with hydrogen, and then creating natural gas that they want to ship to Japan. And they're planning on being operational in 2030. But that's a titanic project between Tokyo Gas and this other company. So we're not the only ones, but definitely the Paris Climate Agreement catalyzed it. I would say also because of renewable deployments on the grid in the past 10 years, there's more cheap power during the off-peak window today than there's ever been. So in California at 12 noon or Texas at 12 noon, electricity on the spot on the open market costs nothing because of all the solar. And commensurately, on a windy day in Germany at 2 o'clock in the morning, electricity costs nothing because of the wind is just flooded with wind power from the North Sea. So the penetration of renewables has gone so fast that now you have this ability to take that electricity when there's an oversupply and turn it into gas. And that never existed before. It used to be the only sources of very cheap electricity off-peak pricing were from nuclear power plants. So in France, where the majority of the grid is nuclear, they also have this problem at 2, 3, 4 in the morning that they have a lot of power that sometimes is close to negative. But even there, you don't have the quantity. It's not as sort of mismatched to the load as all the wind farms in Nebraska or the North Sea going at full tilt in the dark hours in the morning.
Yeah. So I know you kind of covered this, but I want to double tap into your, buying cheap electricity, or you're buying electricity when it's cheapest, let's say that, and then you're selling fuel when it's most valuable. How does that actually work in practice? Like, I know you mentioned the batteries and the storage and stuff like that, but how does that actually look as like a business model, and how do you execute on that?
So we typically will go to an emitter. So let's say it's a building, okay? They have a boiler, and we'll say we'd like to buy your flue gas. So we'll buy your carbon dioxide at $5 a ton of CO2, and they'll say, take it. It's a waste product.
Wasn't using it anyway.
100%. And then we'll say, and in exchange, give us space to install our machine. So then we install our machine. We own and operate the machine. We're responsible for maintenance, buying the electricity to run it, everything. And now we're producing natural gas, which we connect to the pipeline network, and we feed that natural gas into the pipeline network. And we own the gas, and we can sell it to whoever we want. So we'll go to the same emitter. If they have a need for decarbonization because of regulatory or other considerations, we'll give them a right of first refusal at a better price. Say, if you want to buy the gas, it's yours. If you don't, we'll sell it to somebody else. The beauty of the pipeline network is it's not only the world's largest battery. I mean, you have millions of miles of gas pipelines and reservoirs and everything else. So once gas is there, you can store it essentially forever. It also allows you to transmit energy, pretty much anywhere with a relative ease. And transactionally, the way that looks is if we're at the distribution network level, like inside New York City, then the gas goes from us straight to a customer's bill through a licensed gas reseller. If we were at, say, US Steel, in Pittsburgh, and we were then on the gas transmission network, then the way that looks is the gas gets sold from one trader to a next, and they're paying capacity charges along the pipeline in order to move the gas physically to the end customer, whoever that is. So there's a lot of mechanics to the buying and selling of energy, but essentially once you're connected to that pipeline, it can be sold as far as you want and to whoever you want.
It's interesting. Yeah, I really just am so impressed by the business model of like taking a waste product, using, very little space, already existing infrastructure, already existing markets for buying and selling energy in various ways, and you're just saying, hey, we're not optimizing this system. Like, there is more optimization that can be done with the products that are flowing in and out of this system. And it just seems like such a long-term solution for us as humanity in this space.
Well, to be fair, when I started reading back in 2019, I found dozens of papers prepared in Japan and throughout the European Union, less so in the United States, but this is a heavily researched field called power to gas. And all of the sort of smartest people in the room, so to speak, had been publishing for years the way to turn renewable power into the only source of energy is to turn it into gas, because you can store gas for a long duration. So the theory has been there for a very long time.
Of course.
It's just now, because of all the different market conditions coming together, we're one of many that is looking to ride the wave to execution.
Yeah. Okay, so final question for you. What do you think that successful, innovators in the industry, in the energy industry, are gonna need to do over the next decade? Like what is gonna be differentiated? What sort of advice or how do you predict the next decade's gonna go in this industry for real, like, leaders?
So, I mean, I think that we're going to see a lot of the cost of batteries and the cost of solar and wind will continue to drop. It's like the 3-minute mile. China has proven that you can produce these products very cheaply, and so they'll get produced cheaply regardless of tariffs or whatever it is, wherever you are. And so we're going to be living in a world where there's going to be a lot of volatility in power markets. There's going to be enormous amounts of cheap power when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing, and then there's going to be these enormous gaps. And so I think anybody that focuses on different business models around that opportunity is going to do really well. And we certainly see that with the battery developers. I think if I wasn't doing this, I would be in the battery space. It's probably one of the most exciting areas.
Well, you never know. People say it's easy to run 2 companies at once, so just kidding. Well, awesome. Well, Natan, it was so nice to have you on the Lion's Den. I know I learned a lot, and yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure. Thank you.